In today's video, we're going to be going over the Spartan Forge Outfitter, what makes it unique, how to use it, what it tells you, all that good stuff. So for starters, Spartan Forge is, at least right now, an application that gives you predictions on how deer should move based on current conditions. Now, what makes it different than other prediction apps out there at a high level is that it's based entirely on machine learning. So machine learning, or let's say artificial intelligence, if that wording is a little bit more familiar to you, it seems like kind of a futuristic idea, right? But I mean, it's already in use in tons of applications in our everyday lives. It's used in military applications for one, and specifically the guys behind Spartan Forge have done this work in military backgrounds, in addition to being hunters, but also machine learning is where you have a large amount of data, and you're asking a computer to take that data and analyze it and find patterns. And then those patterns that the computer finds can be used to predict future outcomes. An application that probably a lot of people are familiar with would be something like Google Maps or a Waze app on your phone, where you plug in your directions and it'll calculate how long it'll take you to get to a particular destination. And it's pulling in data in real time. Everybody who has their phones with their GPS turned on, it's taking in all that massive amount of data, computing it, and then giving you an update for your future outcome. In this case, how long it's going to take you to get to your destination. So now think about how we would typically try and figure out how deer are going to move on a particular property that we either own or that we're hunting. We might go out there and glass. We might just use our normal observations when we're out there hunting on the weekends or after work. We might use trail camera data and might have big spreadsheets where we're tracking things that might be important, like rain, temperature, barometric pressure, moon phase. And over time, we can kind of get a little bit of a trend going. And we might have hundreds of data points to be able to, support our conclusions on what we think may work on that particular property. But in the case of what Spartan Forge is doing, we have data that's coming in from GPS studies for one. And that's both public and private land studies from across the country. You also look at data inputs like fawn conception dates, deer-car collision data. And so to give an example, what I will show real quickly here is I will show a picture. What we're looking at right here, there's a bunch of little dots on the screen, but we have effectively, the data right here is filtered for one deer. It's one buck. And we're just looking at the time periods of 5 to 7 p.m. over several days. And every certain amount of time, that GPS gives a ping for the location and that gets plotted. So what you're looking at is just a collective of where that deer moves over that time frame, just that 5 to 7 p.m. And when we look at this map, we can start to pick out, okay, between 5 and 7 p.m., there's very clear patterns here. There's little clusters, and we can start to put together a mental picture of how that deer is moving on a daily basis. And we can tell that maybe sometimes it's doing different things than others, but overall there's trends that are starting to appear. Now, what if you take that amount of data that's on that screen and you open it up into a 24-hour period of the day? And instead of one deer, you're looking at 2 deer or 3 deer. And then imagine how much data would be displayed on that screen then. And now think of it from the perspective of Spartan Forge not only just has a couple of deer that they're looking at, they have effectively dozens of GPS collar studies over the entire country, different regions, different terrain types, habitats, public land, private land, various age groups of deer, buck and doe, hundreds of total deer, and effectively multiple millions of total data points. And it very quickly gets to a point where you're like, there's no way that any one person or group of people could really decipher all that data and find out what's important and what's not, because it's just too overwhelming. But give that data to a computer, and it can do that. That's machine learning. It's going through all that massive amount of data and finding where the trends are and finding what the patterns are. With the amount of data that they have in the app right now at the launch, when this video is going live, it's the equivalent of if you had one person hunting every single day, recording everything that could be important, and hunting every day for 260 years. So just to put that kind of in perspective. And now also, that person would have to be hunting in various locations across the country because a deer might react to a certain weather condition, like rain, let's say, in the southeast, differently than they might do in the upper Midwest. So that all sounds good, but of course it's only good if it's actually accurate and telling you the right thing, right? So what they do and what they have done, I guess, over the last several years as they've been building this application and putting it together, is each time they get a new data set that comes in from a university or wherever it's coming from, they take that new data and they test it against the algorithm and see how it predicts. Is it predicting well? Is it not predicting well? And the numbers that I have right now are that currently on the movement prediction, it's batting 67%. So roughly 2/3 of the time, when looking at not trail camera data, not observational field glassing data, but GPS collar study data, the app's predicting exactly how the deer are going to move 2/3 of the time. And there's an upper limit. It can never be 100% because we're dealing with wild animals and factors that are going to be outside of our control, like pressure and various other things. And in terms of the movement pattern type, the app's at about 71% right now. And technically the pattern type is still a kind of a beta phase version of it. The movement is set in stone right now, but the pattern is still being refined a little bit, even though it's obviously doing pretty well. So let's jump into the actual application here. I have it on the web version right now on my computer, but you can open this up in your phone as well out in the field. There's eventually going to be a downloadable app from the App Store, but right now you would just log into your browser and sign in and be able to view it on your phone. So you plug in the zip code of the area that you're interested in, and you have this display. And on the phone, this is just a vertical display, but we have it side by side here on the computer screen. And we have in this first bucket here, your current weather, right? You have temperature, sunrise, sunset, also your moon overhead and underfoot, if that's something you're interested in looking at. And then we roll down, you see the forecast for what's upcoming. And then the piece that obviously most people are going to be interested in is the actual movement prediction. And so you can see that this particular zip code over the next roughly week, we have what's considered transition area movement, and eventually by December 9th it turns into full range movement. And I'll go into detail about what that means. There's also a third option, which would be core area movement. We can click on the drop down here to get some more detailed information on what each of those mean. And then for the pattern forecast, we have either a normal pattern, abnormal, or very abnormal pattern. Again, with the drop down, we'll be able to figure out a little bit more about what that's actually telling us. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that as well. Finally, here on the prediction side, we have when the peak breeding and secondary breeding is supposed to peak. We also have the rutting moon information in there for people that are interested in that. But your peak breeding is going to be the tip of your bell curve. So as most of us know, fawn conception and doe breeding and when they come into heat is kind of shaped like a bell curve where you have that peak conception date, but there's going to be some does on the early side. They're going to start coming into heat, and then you get more and more and more, and it peaks out where you have a maximum amount of does that are in heat at the same time, and then it tapers back off again. And your secondary breeding is going to be roughly a month after that, where it usually isn't quite as extreme, but you have the timing estimates based on your exact locale. And then we scroll down even more here, and you can see your historical average. So you can look at your weather currently and over the next several days and compare that against historical averages over the last 2 weeks. And then finally, the same thing with the wind rose. The wind rose is something you may be familiar with. It's a way of looking at wind that graphically tells you, hopefully pretty easily, what the most common wind directions are and also how strong the wind speeds are in those directions. So when I look at the wind rose here, it's telling me that roughly 12% of the time, which is the most common wind in this particular instance, you have a south wind, and the scale is going to be weighted depending on where you're at. If I'm looking at a North Dakota or a South Dakota map, the red might be 25-mile-an-hour winds. And overall, you can tell that the last couple weeks, winds between east, southeast, and south, most common. And you also get quite a bit of winds that span from north, northeast to west. But it's very uncommon to have a true northeast wind or a true southwest wind, at least over the last couple week period here. And then lastly here, we have a chart that shows just the current wind map. So I just plugged in a different location here, and I want to really focus on what the movement forecast means. So for this particular area, we have core area movement for the next 3 days, and then it switches over to full range. If you read the description here, core area movement likely limited to bedding area for daylight hours. Movement outside of the core area is unlikely. So this is like intended to be the type of day where you just don't see a lot of deer movement in general. If you're hunting your normal spots, if you're hunting your set fixed position stands, pinch points, things where you might expect to see good movement during the rut, days where you just don't see anything out in the normal feeding areas or the fields during daylight hours, it just seems like they're not really moving very well for whatever reason. But based on the GPS collar study data, they're still moving, but a lot of that movement is really still held tightly to the core area, especially during daylight hours. So the thought here is that you shouldn't look at that as a day where it's just going to be bad to hunt in. You might choose to say that, especially if you have a small parcel of land where you're not hunting where the deer are bedding and you don't have access to it. Maybe they're bedding on the neighbors. Then maybe you look at a core area prediction. You say, maybe this is a day where I stay out of the woods. I leave my scent out, give that area some rest, and I choose to hunt on a day where it's more of a full range type of prediction or a transition area prediction. But if, let's say, you're hunting a large tract of public land, core area prediction might tell you that on a day like today, if I'm going out in the woods, I might just need to really make sure I get as close as I can to where some of those known bedding areas are and really try and tuck in as close as I can to try and capture that movement, because it might be one of those days where you get those deer that just kind of get up out of their beds and mill around and feed a little bit just in that real heavy cover around their bedding, but that's about it. And if you're hunting in more of your pinch point type areas, you might not catch that movement. Now let's jump to full range. Increased likelihood of daytime travel throughout the deer's full range. Food, cover, water will dictate size and shape. Every deer is different in this regard. So your full range is like the pattern that you usually are looking forward to, because it gives you your best opportunity for a lot of movement, a lot of total mileage covered throughout the day. It means that, strictly in a 24-hour period, the deer are covering the most amount of distance in that 24-hour period. Now in the rut, that might mean that they're covering a lot of miles during the rut. For early season or late season, when they're on a bed to feed pattern, it might just mean that they're covering more physical distance throughout that given day and expanding and moving throughout a larger area of their home range, which gives you generally a better likelihood that they're going to get to that feeding area during daylight hours. On a day like that, you might not necessarily need to tuck right up tight to that bed in order to see some of that general deer movement. You might be able to see some deer movement in some of those areas that are more spread out and back and in pinch points, and even on food sources, primary food sources, whether they're feeding on oaks or crops or whatever the case may be. Also note that this prediction is for the general deer. It's not specifically for, say, mature bucks age 4 and up. It's giving you the prediction for the general deer. And really the transition area is a prediction that is in between the two. They're going to move a little bit more than they would on a core area prediction day, but not quite as much as a full range day. So it's somewhere in the middle. Increased likelihood of daytime movement along travel routes between core area and destination for staging and feeding. Now, like anything, this is a tool, and you have to take it in context of all of your other inputs that you have as a hunter. So like, let's say, for example, you have a full range movement prediction, but you know that morning is, say, the opening day of a firearms season in a heavily hunted firearms state where the Orange Army is going to be coming in full force, you're hunting public land. That should also have a very heavy influence on what you're going to be doing that particular day and how the deer are going to move. Similarly, if we look at this rut timing chart again, around peak breeding, that's also very commonly referred to as your lockdown phase of the rut, where it seems like you'll have days where the deer might just seemingly disappear. And you might have a day around that lockdown phase where you're getting full range movement. And what's happening in those types of cases is a lot of that movement is happening. The deer are putting on lots of total miles, but it could be happening in very condensed areas in and around where there's a doe and heat. So you have to take things like that into context as well. And now let's look at the pattern forecast. Again, the pattern forecast, at least at the time of the release of this video, is considered a beta feature, but let's just read the description here. Largely based on environmental conditions like wind, this value indicates that normal or abnormal environmental conditions are present. Deer are either negotiating terrain as they normally would, or environmental factors are present that would cause them to alter how they negotiate terrain for a desired destination. So to help illustrate this or explain it a little bit more, I will again pull up this map that I showed earlier. And in this case, we have all of these different clusters of data points. And you can tell that in your most common clusters here, we can see that very likely this deer is probably bedding in this location. And he gets up at around, it's 5 o'clock, and he starts moving, spends a lot of time in that core area as he makes his way to the transition areas and then out to the feeding areas. And he commonly kind of takes this route to the northwest to get to the corner of that field. And then he eventually meanders further out into kind of the middle of the field here, where you again get a big cluster of data points. Even though that's where the GPS collar is pinging most of the time, you still see that there's this cluster that heads out here to the east. And there's also this cluster that heads out here to the south. And then just kind of randomly you have 3 data points that are way over here on the other side of the road, or 3 data points that are way up here on this little creek across, several hundred yards. And so instances like that, when it shows up in the GPS data, you would say that, well, those are abnormal or even very abnormal movement conditions where the deer is less likely to do, for whatever reason, what he would normally do. And again, this brings up kind of an important point about how this type of methodology works, the machine learning. It doesn't know deer biology. We can make inferences based on that. We can read, studies from various universities or organizations from well-respected deer biologists that say this is likely why deer are doing what they do. What the prediction is doing is it's just saying, based on all this information, here's what the deer are likely to do. It doesn't know why, it doesn't care why, it doesn't need to know why. It just needs to know that based on the upcoming environmental conditions, here's what's most likely to happen. So over the course of the season, I've been evaluating the various beta versions and development releases of the app and giving feedback and basing this off of my own observations here in, generally Minnesota and Wisconsin, where I spend most of my time hunting, and just analyzing, does it seem to generally agree with what I'm seeing in the field? Now again, that depends on me doing a good job of picking the right place at the right time, because it might be a great day to hunt, but if I'm in the wrong spot, then obviously it wouldn't be the app's fault. But on the other side, if I see just a phenomenal deer movement day, they're moving all over the place in a day where the app showed that it should have been a core area movement type of day, then that would be good to know too. As just one person, I'm a pretty small sample size, and I also ran several trail cameras over the course of this year that would help me collect information when I couldn't be out in the woods, and also look at things like nighttime versus daytime movement types of data. And while occasionally there's days that might seem to be a little bit off, in the vast majority of the times what I observe either through my trail cameras or through my own observational sightings in the woods is that it seems to be pretty accurate. I can remember one day in particular where we had a big cold front coming in. It was like 10 degrees above average, above average, above average, and then we got that big temperature drop down from like 50 degrees to 30 degrees. We had a strong kind of northwest wind. I'm thinking, man, the deer are gonna move this day. Like just based on my own thoughts, my own biases, based off of just kind of how we generally think as deer hunters and the trends that we tend to perpetuate and say this is the way the deer are gonna move. And the app was saying that the deer weren't gonna move much. It was saying it was gonna be a core area type of prediction. And I'm thinking, well, the day prior I saw deer moving, and so I'm thinking it should be even better today. I was expecting to see deer. I was gonna be shocked if I didn't see deer. And as it turned out, I didn't see a single deer sitting all day, and neither did my wife, who was sitting several hundred yards away overlooking another well-used travel corridor during the pre-rut. And so it was a case like that where I was like, man, I can't deny, trail cameras are slow. We might have had, only a couple pictures looking back at those couple of days during daylight. And on days like that, it was kind of hard to disagree. And then, just kind of generally speaking, as we got into the rut, and I'm thinking, man, this time of year, you're going to start seeing full range every day. But there was a couple days where it was just like, oh, this is going to be average. People in the Midwest, and I think probably most of the country, remember that we had really warm temperatures through kind of your main rut days, kind of that November 7th through 9th around here time frame. And it was really windy, strong south winds, high temperatures, and I was getting a movement prediction of average. And then when the cold front was going to come in, and again, this isn't just based on weather, there's a whole bunch of different inputs that go into this, but generally when you would have expected the deer movement to increase, the app tended to agree with that. And what I chose to do on that November 8th day that was telling me it was an average day of movement despite being, really good potential rut movement, instead of just sitting and parking in one spot over a funnel, we decided to get down and do some more scouting in the hopes that we might be able to find some fresher sign or find a hot doe and kick one up, knowing that the deer may be less likely to move during that particular day than they would in the days following. And as it turned out, we covered a lot of miles that day and ended up getting on a deer and shooting them at 2 in the afternoon in an area that we wouldn't have got down probably and started to walk if it would have been more of that high prediction movement day, full range movement, just a prime rut day where you want to be parked in a tree the entire time. So again, just kind of showed, like, from my perspective, whether you have a good or bad day doesn't necessarily mean you should hunt or should not hunt, but you can take that as a piece of information that'll help guide your decision of how you may want to hunt that particular day. And so based on machine learning, based on this methodology, we have what we have right now. We have this movement prediction that tells you when the deer should move. But with enough data, you can start to look at and filter for different things. And so one thing that Spartan Forge is working on also right now is kind of a where prediction, where it's looking at the topographical data in context with the GPS data and trying to figure out where are the most likely places to check out on a physical map. So that's something that's coming down the pipeline. Also, I did do a podcast with Bill Thompson from Spartan Forge, so I'll have a link to that in the description below if you want a little bit more information about the background, Bill's history, and how this all kind of works in a little bit more detail than I covered in this video. And onto the pricing, you do get a free 14-day trial. It's an annual $19.99 fee, but you can get 25% off if you use the code DIY. So if you guys have any questions, please drop them in the comments down below. I'll do my best to answer them. I'm not by any means an expert on artificial intelligence or machine learning, but I'll do my best to answer any questions you guys do have and probably pass on any questions that are above my level of understanding to be able to try and get answers to you guys for those as well. So thanks for watching.